The first thing Dr. Mara Voss said when the military van came for her was, "I didn't agree to this." The second thing she said, 40 minutes later when the van hadn't stopped and there was no cell signal and the road had turned to gravel, was, "I want to go home." Neither statement changed anything. The driver, a young corporal with a jaw so square it looked borrowed from a propaganda poster, didn't respond to either. He just drove, hands at 10 and 2, headlights cutting through pre-dawn fog that swallowed the Kazakh steppe in both directions. There were no stars. There was no sound except the tires and the distant groan of wind pressing against the van's flanks like something testing the seams. Mara pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the passenger window and let the vibration of the road travel through her skull. She was 34 years old. She had spent the last 6 years of her life working with people whose minds didn't operate according to the standard diagrams, dissociative disorders, post-traumatic presentations, the whole beautiful and terrifying territory where identity became permeable and memory became unreliable geography. She was good at it. She was, by several measures, she found meaningful, and several more she found meaningless, exceptional at it. She was also, as of 16 days ago, unemployed. The specific incident that had ended her contract at the Research Institute involved a 14-year-old named Doran, admitted with a severe dissociative disorder that had resisted 2 years of pharmacological management. The prior treatment team had him on a chemical regimen that kept him functional in the narrow, bloodless sense of the word, present in his body, not wandering the hospital corridors at 3 in the morning, convinced he was someone else, completing the basic locomotor requirements of being alive. He was also, by any measure she applied, not improving. Mara had taken him off the medications over a 3-week taper and put him in a sensory engagement protocol she'd developed. Music, tactile variation, deliberate exposure to nature sounds, a daily practice of identifying 5 physical sensations and placing herself firmly inside each one. Within 40 days, Doran had begun to show measurable, consistent improvement in his ability to identify and inhabit his own experience. Within 60 days, he was, by his own carefully articulated account, more present in his life than he had ever remembered being. The board had not cared about Doran. The board had cared about liability exposure, about the 43 forms she hadn't filed before removing him from the approved protocol, about the 2 complaints lodged by the prior treatment team whose inadequacy she had, they felt, publicly highlighted. The board had expressed these concerns across 3 sessions in a medium-sized room with beige walls and a water carafe that was never quite full, and at the end of the 3rd session, the woman at the center of the table had told her, with the weary precision of someone delivering news they've delivered before, that her contract would not be renewed. Mara had thanked them for their time, which had made the woman's mouth do something complicated, and had walked out into the gray afternoon and stood in the parking lot for a while thinking about Doran, who was still in the hospital and would likely be handed back to the prior treatment team, and about what that meant. She had been thinking about it, off and on for 16 days. Then a man in a military coat had appeared at her apartment door, not knocking so much as materializing, the way certain people do when they've spent enough time in places where knocking is considered naive. He had introduced himself as Commander Derek Solves of the Northern Defense Research Division, and he had a manila folder stamped with a clearance designation she'd never encountered, and he had said, with the measured neutrality of someone reading from a prepared statement but not reading from a prepared statement, that there was an opportunity for her to continue her work in a setting where her methods would encounter fewer institutional constraints. He'd said it with a smile that existed exclusively in the lower half of his face. She'd taken the folder, told him she needed time to consider it, closed the door, read the folder twice, and called an old colleague named Petra who had done 2 years with a military contractor before resigning for reasons she'd never fully explained. Petra had answered on the 3rd ring and listened in silence while Mara described the folder, and then Petra had said very quietly and with a care that was itself informative, "Take it, Mara, I can't tell you why, but take it." Mara had taken it. So here she was, van, gravel, fog. Kazakhstan, judging by the geography she'd managed to track before the highway gave way to regional road and regional road gave way to whatever category this was. The sun was somewhere below the horizon, suggesting it was attempting. It did not appear to be succeeding. The facility when it appeared was not what she'd expected, and the surprise of that was itself informative. She'd built a mental image from the fragments of classified infrastructure she'd encountered in academic papers, the kind of thing that gets footnoted without detail, concrete and razor wire, the architecture of paranoia. What she found instead was a long, low building that could have passed for a regional hospital. Pale exterior walls, industrial windows with diffuse light behind them, a parking lot containing half a dozen unremarkable vehicles. The chain-link fence was more suggestion than security. The gate was the only thing suggesting authority, and it suggested it mainly through the presence of a guard post with 2 soldiers instead of 1, and both of them were watching the van with the specific alertness of people who'd been told precisely what to look for. Commander Solves was waiting at the entrance. He was in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders in the way that came from decades of practical use, rather than any gym, with gray eyes set in a face that had been outdoors through significant weather for long enough that the weather had become part of the face's permanent record. He shook her hand once, firm and brief, with the economy of someone who understood the ritual's function without finding it particularly meaningful. Dr. Voss, thank you for coming. I wasn't given much of a choice. You weren't given no choice. That's a meaningful distinction. He held the door. We have a great deal to discuss. The interior confirmed the external impression. This was a place designed to look functional rather than significant, a deliberate aesthetic of the unremarkable. Antiseptic smell recirculated air with the faint staleness of systems that worked hard and cleaned imperfectly. The kind of fluorescent lighting that did its best impression of daylight and fell somewhat short. She passed labs that looked standard issue, a cafeteria where 4 people ate at 4 separate tables in a silence that had the quality of habit, a woman in a white coat who looked up when they passed, and then, with the deliberation of someone making a decision, looked back down. Solves walked and talked in the manner of someone who had given many tours of this same building but had not allowed it to become rote, which she noted. He paused at a junction of corridors with a clipboard in his hand that he wasn't quite consulting. Everything I'm about to tell you is classified at a level that functionally means the following. You cannot discuss it with anyone outside this facility. Not family members, not former colleagues, not in writing, not verbally, not through implication or inference. You understand the conditions. I understand the conditions. The mission designation is NS Carillion, a deep-range survey vessel crewed by 2 people, Commander Joss Arnett and Systems Officer Kaito Yun. The mission objective was passive observation at the outer heliosphere boundary, the point where the sun's influence ends and the interstellar medium begins. Duration 3 years, returning 11 days ago. He looked at her. Arnett did not survive re-entry. Yun did. That's fortunate. The recovery team that reached Yun's landing site reported that his injuries were healing, not had healed. Were healing actively, at a rate inconsistent with any biological process they'd been trained to account for. He paused with the precision of a person who has learned to let information settle. They also reported that the ship's internal sensors, before the final system failure during re-entry, had recorded something in the airlock section, a biological anomaly, something of present in the ship that was not on the pre-launch manifest. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere down a branch she couldn't see, something hummed, a piece of equipment, a ventilation system. You're telling me it hitched a ride, she said. I'm telling you something rode the ship home, and that it appears to currently be residing within Yun's lower thoracic cavity. She kept her face neutral with effort. He doesn't know. He knows what we've told him, that there may be a biological contaminant from the mission requiring monitoring. He has accepted that framing without apparent skepticism, which is either trust or a choice not to pursue. That's partially what we need you to determine. What's the other part? Our physician, Dr. Reyes, can tell you in detail, but the summary is this. Yun is physiologically extraordinary in ways that correlate with whatever is inside him. Bone density has increased. Tissue repair is running at approximately 6 times baseline. He recovered from injuries that should have required weeks in approximately 4 days. He opened a door at the corridor's end with a key card. He is, in raw biological terms, becoming something more than the man who left 3 years ago. She stepped through the door into an observation corridor. Glass panel, one way, running the length of one wall. Solves touched a control and the polarization cleared. Beyond the glass was a room furnished with the specific kind of normalcy that told you someone had thought carefully about what normalcy should look like: a bed with appropriate bedding, a desk with books arranged with slight disorganization, a reading lamp casting a warm circle, a window showing a projected image of sky, pale morning blue, convincing except for its perfectness. A man sitting at the desk. Kaito Yun was perhaps 40, lean in the manner of long-duration spacers, which wasn't wasted so much as concentrated, as if the body had assessed its inventory over 3 years of limited supply chains and concluded that several things were unnecessary and had quietly stopped maintaining them. He had a stillness about him that wasn't passivity. He was reading, and he was reading the way someone reads when they've been doing it for a long time. And the book is something they've chosen rather than something They've been given. His hands were steady. He turned a page. Mara studied him for a long time without speaking. How long has the organism been coming out at night, she said. Solves's pause was brief, but it was there. You got to that fast. It's the logical next question. It's symbiotic, you said, which means there's a negotiated territory. The host needs to sleep, the organism. Every night, approximately 2 to 3 hours after he enters deep sleep, it emerges. It moves through the facility. His voice remained level. We attempted containment on 3 occasions. We lost 4 personnel. Lost. Yes. The man in the room turned another page. The lamp made his face warm, and it returns on its own every night before he wakes. He has no memory of it, and Dr. Reyes's assessment of the interface, they appear to be mutually dependent. The organism benefits from the host biochemical output. The host benefits from the organism's repair activity. Separation, based on current understanding, carries significant risk of killing Yun. Potentially. And your goal is still to separate them. Our goal is to understand the organism. Separation is the objective once the understanding supports it safely. She looked at the man reading. He had the posture of someone for whom solitude was a familiar room. She knew that posture because she had it herself. Let me talk to him, she said. They met the following morning in a room with 2 chairs facing each other across a table that was too small to be a barrier and too large to ignore. The guards who brought Yoon stood outside the closed door, which Mara had asked about, and Solves had explained was standard procedure, which she'd accepted because arguing about it would cost her time she didn't have. Yoon sat with his hands folded on the table and looked at her with dark eyes that did the thing she'd occasionally encountered in people who'd spent significant time in genuinely isolated environments, a quality of direct attention that had dropped certain social conventions because those conventions hadn't been reinforced for long enough to remain automatic. Another doctor, he said. Different kind. I'm not here for your blood pressure or your cellular repair rate. Then what are you here for? To understand what you remember and what you think is happening to you. The smallest pause. I remember the mission. I don't remember coming home. Walk me through the last thing you clearly remember. He looked somewhere past her left shoulder, the way people look when they're navigating actual memory rather than constructing a story. We were at the boundary, the heliosphere terminus. The sensors had been registering a density fluctuation for about 18 hours. Not an instrument malfunction, we checked 3 times, but something real in the interstellar medium just past the bow shock. I went out to manually verify the external array alignment. He came back from whatever interior distance he'd been visiting. That's where it stops. And you woke up here. In the recovery pod first, 4 broken ribs, fractured collarbone, left arm in 2 places. He stretched the left arm slightly, not dramatically, just a small reflexive movement of someone reminding themselves of an absence. They were healed in 4 days. Does that seem normal to you? No, but you haven't asked about it. I've asked. I get answers that are very precise about the absence of information they're prepared to share. He looked at her with those direct eyes. You're the first one who seems like you might actually tell me something true. She studied him. He was patient in the way that came from practice, not from nature, or not only from nature. 3 years in a small ship with another person. 3 years where patience was either cultivated or people got hurt. She could see in him the man who'd chosen to cultivate it. I'm going to be honest with you, she said. Not because I've been instructed to, but because I think it's the only way either of us develops an accurate picture of what happened. And I need an accurate picture. All right, there is something inside you. It came aboard during your EVIA. It's been there since. It has been maintaining your health, repairing your injuries, operating in ways we don't fully understand. She watched his face. The flicker she saw was not surprise. It was recognition with the relief that recognition carries. You knew, I knew something was there. When? Day 3. I was lying in the recovery pod and He stopped, searching for the word with the care of someone who understood the difference between saying the accurate thing and the impressively worded thing. There is a feeling of not being alone that isn't the same as having someone in the room. It's less visual than that, more felt. He paused again. Like being accompanied, she said, because she had the word for it. She'd had the word for a long time. He looked at her. Yes, exactly that. And I lay there for about an hour just existing with it, with the feeling. And I thought, something came home with me. Were you afraid? The question sat between them. No, he said slowly. That's the strange part, isn't it? I was in a medical facility. I was injured. I had no memory of re-entry. Joss was. He stopped. Something in his face changed in the way things change when a name arrives in a conversation and brings all its weight with it. Joss didn't make it. I knew that from the first morning. Nobody told me directly, but you can read the information in the way people don't say things. He looked at the table. I should have been afraid. But the feeling of being accompanied was steady, calm, like something was keeping watch. Like what? He considered. Like the way you feel when you're asleep somewhere you trust. She sat with that. Outside in the corridor, a cart went by with the specific metallic protest of institutional equipment. Someone said something in a low voice. Ordinary sounds in an extraordinary place. Tell me about the mission, she said. Not the end, the long part in the middle. He exhaled slowly. She understood, the exhale of a person being given permission to talk about something that has been accumulating. It's quiet. People imagine that space is dramatic, the void, the dark, the vastness. And it is those things, but once you're in it long enough, it stops being a concept and starts being a context. Like a room you've been in so long you've stopped perceiving the walls. He paused. Joss and I had been together in a very small space for 36 months. We'd read every book in the ship's library twice. We'd played every game. We'd had every conversation we were going to have. By month 18, we could sit in the same room for 10 hours without speaking, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just. He made a small gesture, shared quiet. Were you close? The hands on the table shifted. He was the most careful person I've ever known. Careful in the real sense, full of care. He cared about everything. He worried about everyone. He had a son in primary school, and he'd recorded video messages for every birthday for the next 8 years before we left, just in case. He paused. He was supposed to watch his son open the one for his 9th birthday at home. I'm sorry. He looked at her. You're the first person in this facility who has said that. She noted that. She would think about it later, and think about what it said about the particular culture Solves had built here, whether by design or simply by the gravity of what the work was. The thing that came aboard with you, she said carefully. You said you felt it from day 3. You've been in this facility for 9 days beyond the initial recovery. That's 12 days of being accompanied. How has it changed? He thought. I understand it better now. I don't understand it. I can't articulate what it is or what it wants in any way that would mean anything to a person who hasn't felt it. But I'm more fluent, maybe, in what it feels like. The way you get fluent in a place after you've lived there long enough. You stop translating and start understanding directly. Does it communicate? I don't know if that's the right word. It's not language. It's more like, he spread his hand slightly, resonance. Like when 2 strings are tuned to the same pitch and you pluck one, the other vibrates. It's that. But in my chest, in the bones. He looked at her steadily. I know this sounds like I need your help for reasons other than the stated ones. It doesn't, she said. It sounds like someone trying to describe an experience they don't have an existing vocabulary for. Is that what you hear? I'm a psychiatrist. I hear that every day. And the people who are fabricating or confabulating sound completely different from the people trying and failing to find words for something real. You sound like the second kind. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what do they want with it? She decided in that moment that she would tell him the truth as she understood it, when she understood it. Not everything at once. She didn't have everything yet. But she wouldn't manage him with the facility's careful absence of information. I'm still finding out, she said. But I'll tell you when I do. He nodded once. It was the nod of a person who'd been lied to enough times to recognize what honesty looked and sounded like. She spent 3 days building the picture. She had 4 hours with Yoon each morning, sessions that ranged from structured psychological assessment to conversations that had no structure other than the direction of genuine interest. She learned about his training, which had been thorough and demanding, and had selected for people who could tolerate isolation without filling it with projection. She learned about his daughter, 12 years old, living with her mother in a coastal city, with a ferocity of intelligence that Yoon described with the specific pride of a parent who has identified the thing in their child that will outlast everything. He'd spoken to her twice since coming to the facility. Both conversations monitored, both brief. She had 2 hours with Reyes each afternoon, which she found more productive than she'd expected. Largely because Reyes was fighting something, she could see him fighting it. The internal argument of a scientist between the results and their implications. He was excellent at his work. She could tell that from the documentation, from the precision of his language, from the way he'd structured his analyses to leave no exits. He was also, she thought, genuinely frightened of what the analyses were pointing toward, and the fear was making him aggressive in the compensatory way she'd encountered before in researchers whose data had gotten ahead of their frameworks. She had 1 hour each evening in Solves' office, going through the video footage frame by frame while he answered her questions with the precision of a person who answered questions carefully, because he'd been in enough situations where careless answers had consequences. The footage was 9 nights of the organism's movements, mapped and timestamped. She built a behavioral profile over those 3 days that she would later describe as the most unusual and most certain piece of clinical work she'd ever done. Unusual because the subject had no face in any sense she could read, no vocalization she could catalog, no behavioral lexicon that corresponded to anything she'd trained on. Certain because the patterns were unmistakable once she'd decided to look at them as patterns rather than as threat indicators. The organism was not aggressive. It was curious. It was methodical. It moved through the room with the attention of something that was trying to understand where it was. It stopped longest at the projected window, 11 to 17 minutes on every recording, in the same orientation, with the same absolute stillness. She timed the window stops across all 9 nights, and the distribution was so narrow it suggested not random. Settling but something closer to ritual. Something it did because the doing of it mattered. On the 4th evening after the footage review, she said to Solves, "I want to be in the room tonight." He looked at her across the desk. "I want to be in the room when it's out," she said. "Not to interact with it, not to approach it or do anything that could be read as threatening, just to be present." The 3 previous attempts to have people in the room with it were attempts to contain it. That is categorically different from simply being present. She held his gaze. The footage shows consistent non-aggression. The only incidents involved personnel attempting physical intervention. "I'm not proposing physical intervention. You could be killed, yes. I could. I'm asking for the opportunity to not be killed in a room with something that, based on 9 nights of footage, appears to have no interest in killing anyone who isn't trying to grab it." He studied her. She'd noticed that he had a way of studying people. Not the evaluative look of someone deciding whether to trust you, but the look of someone integrating information about you into an existing model and determining where the discrepancies were. It was, in its way, the same thing she did. "I'll need 2 armed guards at the door," he said. "That's fine. Body camera, active feed, fine. You stay near the door. You do not approach the subject. If it approaches you and comes within 2 meters, you signal for extraction. I understand the conditions." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the key card on his desk and set it back down, which she understood was not a meaningless gesture. "You believe it thinks," he said. "I believe it does something that functions like thought." "Yes, that's not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It's not. But it's close enough to require consideration." He looked at the ceiling. 7 o'clock briefing. Gear up by 9. She went to find Yoon after the meeting and sat with him through the evening meal, the cafeteria, 4 tables, the institutional silence. She didn't tell him about the night's plan. She talked to him about his daughter instead, about the 47 messages he'd sent that Solves had relayed, about what he planned to do when the facility released him. He talked about the coastal city and a specific dock where his daughter liked to watch fishing boats come in, and the way the light hit the water in the late afternoon, and how she had asked to go there every summer since she was 4. She watched his face while he talked about it, the specific quality of the expression, not nostalgia, because nostalgia had grief in it, and this was something cleaner. More like the careful maintenance of a thing you intend to return to. She recognized it from her own face, occasionally in mirrors. After dinner, when the guards took him back, she sat at the empty table with her cold coffee and looked at the fluorescent lights and thought about what she was going to do in 5 hours. At 2:17 by her watch, Yoon's breathing changed. She was in the chair by the door, back to the wall, wearing the body camera over her jacket, the 2 guards just outside with instructions from Solves that were specific and could be summarized as, "You come in only if she signals, and you do not interpret anything as a signal unless she explicitly signals." She'd been in the chair since 2, not because she needed the preparation time, but because she needed to know she could sit in the room in the dark and be comfortable enough to think clearly. The lamp was on. It made the same warm circle over the same desk with the same books. The projected sky was doing something that approximated a clear night, stars, which she knew were fake, but which had the right density and distribution to register as real in peripheral vision. Yun was in the bed, breathing the deep, regular breath of someone genuinely asleep, the kind of sleep that was too deep for pretending. His breathing deepened past the threshold, shifted into something slower, something that was less specifically sleep and more like a very low tide. And then it began. She had watched it on camera 9 times. Watching it in person was a different experience at a level she hadn't fully prepared for. The camera made it flat. The room made it immediate. The organism emerged from Yoon's chest with the unhurried care of something that knew the territory, the way a person coming out of deep water knows not to rush the transition between elements. There was no blood, no damage, No violence in any component of the movement, just emergence. Deliberate, controlled, specific. It resolved to the floor and stood there for a moment while her hindbrain worked through its competing attempts to classify what she was seeing. Large animal, mechanical system, shadow given mass. Her hindbrain was not winning. She had anticipated this, the instinct's attempt to override the intellect, and she had prepared for it in the same way she prepared for difficult sessions. By grounding herself in her body in the specific physical reality of being in a chair with her feet flat on the floor and her hands in her lap, 4 limbs, head-like structure, surface that absorbed light rather than reflecting it so that the night vision spectrum gave it a strange, inconsistent quality, like trying to look directly at something that resisted being looked at. It was not camouflage in any mechanical sense. It was more like the organism had a relationship with light that was simply different from what she was used to. It oriented. Then it looked at her. She knew she was being looked at because of the specific quality of attention that being looked at produces, regardless of whether the looker has eyes. You can identify something in the way the scanning stopped, the stillness of a directed gaze. She breathed. She kept her hands in her lap. She held its attention, or what she experienced as its attention, and did not move and did not look away and did not perform anything for the camera on her chest, or for the men outside the door, or for Solves watching the feed from wherever he was, watching it. She looked at it the way she looked at patients in their first sessions, with the deliberate declaration of full attention. Here I am. I am not going anywhere. You do not need to rush. Slowly, she raised her hand, palm out, fingers together, held at shoulder height for 3 seconds and then lowered. Not a greeting exactly, a visibility marker. I am here. I see you. I know you see me. The thing that happened then was the thing she'd been least prepared for. A vibration. Not sound, her ears registered nothing. Not touch, nothing physical contacted her. But something in the space between them changed, as if a very large, very quiet bell had been struck somewhere close. And what she was feeling was the resonance carrying through the air and through the bones of the room and through whatever it was that allowed very large, very quiet things to be felt. It lasted 3 or 4 seconds, then it stopped. The organism turned toward the projected window. It walked with that same precision she'd cataloged in the footage, the deliberate placement, the scan and move pattern of something that navigated by information rather than momentum. It reached the window. It stood in front of the artificial night sky, in front of the fake stars distributed at the right density to fool peripheral vision. It stood there for 17 minutes. She timed it. She watched it stand there, and she thought about the estimate that Reyes had made, the number she'd been sitting with since Reyes had told her. The age estimate derived from isotope markers in the cellular material, a number so large it ceased to be a year count and became something more like a geological epoch. The kind of number that, when you held it next to the word alone, changed the meaning of both. She looked at the silhouette of the organism against the fake stars and thought, 17 minutes every night. Not random, not incidental. A practice. I see you, she thought, without speaking it. Standing there looking at stars that aren't real because the real ones are, however many light years away. Standing there looking at the wrong sky because standing there is the thing you can do. At the end of the 17 minutes, the organism moved from the window to the desk. It considered the books with the scanning attention she'd noted before. Not random, but methodical. Like someone running their fingers along the spines in a library. It touched nothing. It only looked, with that directed quality of attention that she was beginning to read, haltingly, as curiosity. Pure and patient and without the agenda that she associated with human curiosity. No goal, no acquisition. Just the act of looking at things that were new and finding out what they were. After the desk, it moved toward her. She breathed. The guards were outside. The signal was a raised fist. She kept her hands in her lap. It approached to approximately 4 feet and stopped. At 4 feet, the sense of its presence was significantly more immediate, not threatening, but large in the way that truly large things are large, occupying space in a manner that the body can't fully ignore. It stood there for perhaps 40 seconds. She sat in the chair. They occupied the same small volume of air, and neither of them did anything except exist in it. Then the organism turned and resumed its circuit of the room. Books again, window again, briefly. Back to the bed, where it hovered near Yoon with that same stillness she'd seen on camera, the quality of keeping watch. At 3:58, she watched it return. When it was done, Yoon sighed once. The deep, settling sigh of a person finding a more comfortable position in sleep. She sat in the chair until dawn came through the projected window in its fake, perfect way. She went to Solves in the morning and said, I need the full briefing, not the institutional version, the actual goals of this program. He looked at her across the desk. He had the look of a man who'd been deciding, probably for several days, where the threshold was. "You understand the classification implications," he said. "I understand them." He closed the office door. He sat back in his chair in the manner of someone allowing themselves to be slightly more candid than their posture usually permitted. The organism represents a biological enhancement interface. If the mechanism by which it maintains Yoon's physiology can be understood, isolated, and reproduced, the applications are. He paused, choosing words, transformative, from a military capability standpoint, from a medical standpoint, from a long-duration space operations standpoint. Humans who don't degrade, who heal, who can sustain extreme conditions without breaking down. He looked at her steadily. "That is not a small thing." "No," she said. "It's not. And Yoon? What about Yoon? If you extract the organism, what happens to him?" The pause before his answer was exactly long enough to tell her everything. "We don't know. The dependency may be bilateral at this point. His baseline physiology may have adjusted to the elevated maintenance. Removing the organism may kill him, may significantly compromise his function. Yes, which is a softer way of saying the same thing." She kept her voice even. "And if the organism is extracted and survives extraction, you have the organism. And you have a man whose body no longer knows how to maintain itself at the level it's been running at, because something that has been doing that work has been taken out of him by force. Dr. Voss, I'm not arguing with you right now. I'm making sure I understand the picture." She stood. "I'm going to try something that none of you have tried, because none of you have sat in a room with it in the dark and had a conversation with it." He looked at her. "You had a conversation, not with words, with presence, which is a kind of conversation." She moved to the door. "I need more sessions with Yoon, and I need you to not run Reyes's extraction protocol this week. The program requires progress, Dr. Voss. We've been at a holding pattern for. I need the week." He was quiet. She waited at the door. 4 days, he said, "then we reassess." She went back to Yoon with 4 days, and a plan that depended on a premise she could not prove, and a connection she could only assume was real, because everything she had seen pointed toward it. The first day she did nothing except what she'd been doing, sitting with him, talking, letting him talk about his daughter and the dock and the fishing boats and the light. She also talked about herself, which she did rarely in professional contexts and had decided to do here, because the situation was beyond professional contexts in ways that made the conventional rules feel like a jacket she'd outgrown. She told him about Doran, about the board, about the forest when she was 9, and the feeling of being accompanied that had never entirely gone away. He listened in the same way he did everything, with the specific quality of full attention that came from practice, from the long training of being in a space where attention was the only commodity. The second day, she talked to Reyes. He came to her office. They'd given her one, a small room with a desk and a view of the parking lot. In the evening, after most of the facility had gone to the tired quiet of an institutional night, he came the way he had before, without announcement, with the look of a person who'd arrived at a decision that cost him something. He sat down and put a tablet on the desk between them. "I've been running parallel analyses," he said. "On the compound the organism produces the repair agent." He looked at the tablet and then at her. "It's not targeted to human biology. It works on every tissue sample I've tested. Mammalian, avian, cellular material from 3 different species. It works on all of them, equally well. So it didn't evolve alongside us. It couldn't have. The mechanism is completely exogenous. But the compatibility is." He rubbed the back of his neck, the gesture of a man whose framework was being stressed at its joints. "It's too good, too universal. Like something designed for maximum cross-species application. You think it was engineered. I think something engineered it. Or something designed the species that produces it." He stopped. "I don't know. The math keeps arriving at conclusions I don't have a box for." She waited. "The decay rate of the cellular samples I have," he said, "is approximately 0. The material doesn't degrade. I've been running the isotope analysis 3 times, and each time, he picked up the tablet, put it down. The age estimate I generated, the number. "Tell me," he told her. It was the same number she'd been sitting with since the last time he'd told her, the large, quiet geological number, and she sat with it again in the small room with the parking lot view and the recirculated air. "If it's been traveling," she said, "for that long, then the things it has accompanied," he said quietly, "and the things it has watched die, the number, yes." They sat with that together for a moment. "I came to tell you," he said, "because I think you're right about not using force. And I think you need to know what you're going in there to ask." She appreciated that. More than she said, because saying it would have taken more time than she had. She told him that with her eyes, and he received it with his, and then he left, and she sat at the desk until midnight writing in the notebook she kept that wasn't for any official record. What she wrote was this. It chose. Every step of this, coming aboard, staying during the crash, maintaining him, coming out at night instead of staying hidden, looking at the camera, stopping in front of me in the dark, every step's a choice. The only question is whether it can make one more. On the morning of the third day, she went to Yun and told him everything. It took an hour. He listened in the particular way he listened, without interruption, with that quality of receiving information rather than waiting for gaps to speak into. She told him the program's goals. She told him Reyes's analysis. She told him the age estimate. She told him what she suspected would happen if the extraction proceeded and what she was going to try instead. When she was done, he was quiet for a long time. They're going to do it regardless, he said. Yes, eventually. Unless we change what's possible. By showing them it's a person. By showing them it makes choices. Which is the only evidence they'll accept for the thing you and I already know, which is that it's a person. He looked at the table. You want me to ask it to leave. I want you to ask it to make a demonstration. To leave voluntarily in a controlled way in front of the cameras in a way that shows decision-making rather than automatic behavior. She held his gaze. The hard part is this. You have to be willing to ask it knowing that it might say no. And if it says no, then we're exactly where we are now. Yes. And if Reyes's team goes in, I'll be honest with you. 4-armed personnel last time. The organism didn't try to kill any of them until the third one got within arm's reach with a restraint device. Even then, she paused. Even then the deaths were fast. Not prolonged. I've watched the footage. It wasn't angry. It was protecting itself. There's a difference. It protected itself. And then it went back in your body the same night. He processed that. It's not a weapon, he said. No, it's not. They want to make it one. They want to understand it so they can reproduce what it does. But the trajectory of that kind of research, when the subject has no rights and no recognized status, the trajectory is what you're imagining. He looked at his hands. The left arm where the bones had healed. How do I ask it? You said it operates through resonance, through something that functions like emotional communication rather than language. She leaned forward. I need you to think about your daughter, the specific weight of her, the first time you held her, the first sound she made. I need you to hold that feeling, not think about it. Feel it. And I need you to direct it toward whatever presence you sense in there. And I need you to also hold, alongside that feeling, the knowledge of what will happen if nothing changes. He closed his eyes. The room went quiet in a specific way. Rooms go quiet when something is happening in them that doesn't make sound. The vibration came. She felt it clearly now. The resonance of the large bell, the humming in her chest and in the bones of her inner ears. It was longer than it had been in the observation room, deeper. The quality of it was different in a way she couldn't articulate then and would struggle to articulate later, but she wrote in her notebook afterward. It felt like receiving something, like a door opening from the other side. It lasted 8 seconds. When it ended, Yoon's eyes were open and wet at the corners. I think it understood, he said. What did you feel from it? He was quiet for a moment. Agreement, he said carefully. And something else. Not exactly what I'd call feeling. More like when you've been somewhere alone for a very long time and someone finally sits down next to you. He paused. It felt like relief. She sat with that. Tonight, he said. I asked it to do it tonight. The crisis came the next morning at 6:45, and it was Reyes who precipitated it, though Mara had seen it gathering in him for 2 days like weather building in the distance. She was on her way to breakfast when she passed the lab that adjoined the long corridor and saw through the window, the one people weren't supposed to be able to see through from this angle. But the polarization on this section had been slightly off since she'd arrived, and she'd cataloged the gap. An extraction team in protective equipment and Reyes at the board pointing to a diagram of Yoon's thoracic cavity. She stopped. She counted 3 people in protective gear, 2 with equipment cases, Reyes with a pointer, and a man in the back who was wearing the kind of face shield associated with biological containment procedures. She turned around and walked back to the corridor junction. Then she walked very quickly to Yoon's room. The guards outside his room were not the regular morning shift. There were 4 of them, 2 on each side of the door, and the 2 nearest her were already shifting their posture as she approached. I need to see Yoon, she said. Commander's orders. No civilian access until the procedure, until the what, is complete. She turned and walked to Solves's office with her hands in fists. He was at his desk with the look of a decision made and arrived at and settled into. The flat composure of someone past the point of deliberation. The clipboard was on the desk. The pen was in his hand. You moved the timeline, she said. We've been at a holding pattern for 11 days, Doctor. Voss. The program, I told you I had 4 days. You've had 3. And I've reviewed the footage from your session with Yun yesterday, and I understand you've been briefing him on classified program details, which he had a right to know, because it's his body. She put both hands on his desk. She kept her voice level with effort that was becoming visible. If you do this now, you may kill him. You have acknowledged that possibility. You are proceeding with a procedure that may kill the man you've been observing for 11 days, who has a 12-year-old daughter who has been waiting for her father to come home. Because you cannot allow yourself one more day of waiting. The decision is made. Then unmake it. He looked at her. 24 hours, she said, not 4 days, 24 hours. If what I've set up tonight doesn't produce clear evidence of voluntary cognition, in a form your cameras can document and your scientists can analyze, I will step aside entirely. You will proceed with the extraction and I won't obstruct it. She held his gaze with everything she had, everything she'd spent her career building, the absolute stillness of a person who means what they're saying without performance. But you will give me tonight. Because I have been in that room with that organism, and it has been in that room with me, and what I have seen is not a resource, and if you proceed tomorrow without trying tonight, you will have spent 14 days here and not once asked the most important question. And what is the most important question? Whether it will choose. The silence in the office was the kind that had a decision in it. If there's no clear evidence by morning, he said, Ray's proceeds at 8. She went back to Yun. They sat together through the afternoon and into the evening. She didn't rehearse him. There was nothing to rehearse. The moment either was or it wasn't, and rehearsal would only introduce a kind of self-consciousness that might interfere with the connection she was counting on. Instead, they talked about ordinary things, about the doc, about his daughter's intelligence, the specific shape of it, the way she'd been asking him increasingly detailed questions about orbital mechanics since she was 7, about the fishing boats and the afternoon light. At 8 in the evening, he said, You know what I've been thinking about? Tell me. That it's been out there alone for all that time, and it followed us. Followed 2 people in a small ship to the edge of the solar system, and then it stayed. He looked at his hands. I think it was watching us for a while before it came aboard. While we were at the boundary. I think it was deciding. What do you think it was deciding? Whether we were worth the risk. He looked up. Of not being alone anymore. She looked at him. And you think we were. I think Joss was. I think the kind of person who records 8 years of birthday messages just in case. He stopped. I think whatever it is, wherever it came from, it recognized something. His voice was steady. I think it knows the difference between being used and being chosen. And I think it chose. And I think that's the thing they can't see from outside the room. She sat with him until the guards came at 10. He didn't reach for her hand or say anything dramatic in departure. He just stood and the guards came in, and he walked to the door, and at the door he turned back. Mara, he said. She looked at him. Thank you for sitting in the room with it. She watched the guards take him down the corridor and then sat in his chair for a while, in the room with the desk and the books and the projected sky, which was currently doing a convincing approximation of a cloudy evening. At 2 in the morning, Solves and Reyes and 2 technicians were in the monitoring room. Mara stood behind them. At 2:17, Yun's breathing shifted. What happened next was not what any of them had expected, though Mara had come as close to expecting it as anyone. The emergence was the same as every night, the unhurried, careful resolution from within. But once the organism was on the floor, it did not move toward the window. It did not scan the room. It stood in the center of the floor and waited. 10 seconds. 20. Then, with a deliberateness that was unmistakable, it moved to the center of the room, the point most directly visible to the camera mounted in the corner. And it stopped there. And it stood in a stillness so complete and so directed that even Reyes at the monitor went still in response. It turned toward the camera, not scanning, not the behavioral pattern of a creature investigating its environment. This was orientation. I know where you are. I know you are watching. I am standing here so that you can see me. It stood there for 6 minutes. 6 minutes of absolute visibility, of nothing that could be interpreted as aggression or randomness or instinct. 6 minutes of a creature that had been alive for longer than any context they could hold, that had traveled distances they couldn't process, that had chosen to come into this room inside a man who'd needed a reason to keep being alive. 6 minutes of that creature, standing in front of a camera and demonstrating in the only language available to it the fact of its own personhood. Then it moved to the wall below the camera. It placed one extension against the wall, gently, with the specific care of something that understood the difference between contact and force. Held it there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then it stepped back, returned to the room's center, stood there, and slowly, with the same unhurried deliberateness with which it had emerged, it moved back to the bed, back to Yun, and Return's breathing shifted into the deep sigh of settling. The monitoring room was completely silent. Reyes hadn't spoken in 4 minutes. He was looking at the now empty room on the monitor with the expression of a person whose model of the world had just been revised at a foundational level. Solves was looking at the same screen. He had the clipboard in his hand and he set it down on the console beside him, and the sound it made was very quiet in a very quiet room. That wasn't instinct, Reyes said finally, after a long time. No, Mara said. It wasn't. It knew where the camera was, yes. It went there deliberately, yes. Reyes was quiet. I need to revise my analysis, he said. Solves was still looking at the monitor. Cancel the 8 o'clock, he said to no one in particular. Both technicians nodded. The aftermath was complicated and slow and involved people above Solves's authorization level and at least one secure conference call during which Mara was asked to describe what she'd seen in the room 3 separate times by 3 different people, asking essentially the same question. Are you certain it was deliberate? She said yes each time. She said yes in a tone that communicated clearly that being asked a 4th time would be inadvisable. The extraction program was not abandoned. She had no illusions about that. It was restructured. New protocols, new classification, new language. A formal acknowledgement, buried in documentation that would never be declassified, that the organism had demonstrated evidence of voluntary goal-directed behavior. That evidence was, in the language of the classification system, recorded and considered. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. The machine that wanted to understand it in order to use it did not simply stop because one creature had stood in front of a camera, but it slowed. It acknowledged the existence of a question it had previously been treating as settled. That was something. It was not everything. It was something. Yun was permitted to return home 5 months later. The ongoing monitoring was exactly as she'd expected, indefinite, thorough, surveillance embedded in the ordinary texture of his life in a way he'd been briefed on and had accepted with the weary pragmatism of someone who'd understood the terms before the formal notification arrived. She drove him to the transit hub on the morning of his departure. They sat in the vehicle for a while after she'd parked before going in the particular silence of people who've said most of what there is to say and are sitting with the remainder. Will you keep working for them? He asked. For a while, there are still things I can do from inside that I can't do from outside. And when that stops being true, then I'll leave. She looked at the transit hub entrance, the ordinary movement of people with ordinary destinations. How is it today? The movement, he considered. Quieter than it used to be, not diminished, more settled. Like when you've been in a place long enough that the novelty of the place stops generating noise and it's just where you are. Good quiet. Yes. He paused. She's going to ask about it, my daughter. What will you tell her? The truth, the version of it she can use. That something very old and very far from home followed her father back and decided to stay. He looked at her. That sometimes the universe is lonely in ways that have nothing to do with how big it is. She thought about that for a moment. It was a good thing to tell a 12-year-old. It was a good thing to tell anyone. He got out of the car. She got out too, and they stood in the parking lot in the ordinary morning with the ordinary sounds of a world that had no idea what had just happened inside a facility in Kazakhstan, and she shook his hand, and he nodded once with the fullness of a nod that carries everything it needs to. And then he went into the transit hub, and she stood in the parking lot for a while and looked at the sky. She went back to the facility that afternoon and filed her next round of reports and attended the restructuring meeting and said what needed to be said. She made the case again and again and again in language that the system could hear, for the category it kept trying not to create. First contact voluntary, the one that meant the thing in that building was not a resource, was not an asset, was something older than the categories they'd built for it. She was not always heard. She was not always successful. But she was persistent in the specific, grinding, low dramatic way that people are persistent when they have decided that the work is the work, and they are going to show up and do it regardless of how much the institution wants them to stop. She thought on the hard days about Doran, about the 14-year-old who'd been running on the wrong medication in the wrong treatment, present in his body in the narrow, bloodless sense but not actually there, about what it had taken to bring him back to himself. About how the right therapy was sometimes the one that looked the least like therapy and the most like sitting with someone in the same room until they remembered they were worth being sat with. She thought about the organism standing at the projected window for 17 minutes every night, looking at the fake stars. She thought about the resonance of the large bell. She kept working. In a coastal city on a specific dock, a man named Kaido Yoon sat with his daughter in the late afternoon and watched fishing boats come in. The light was doing what she'd always told him it did, flattening gold across the water, making the boats look like they were arriving from somewhere genuinely significant rather than just from the sea. His daughter sat close beside him with her shoulder against his, the way she'd sat since she was 4, with a confidence in the rightness of his presence that he found extraordinary and intended to deserve. The presence at the edge of his awareness kept its patient watch, as it always did, as it had since the day at the boundary when something had decided. As it would, he thought, for a long time to come. He put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. She leaned into him without looking up from the water. The light came down. The boats arrived. Out past the heliosphere, in the dark that was older than any story humans had told about the dark, the universe did what it had always done. It continued, in its vast, cold, particular silence, through distances that made the word distance inadequate, past the accumulated evidence of everything that had ever existed long enough to leave a mark. And somewhere in that silence, in the part of it that was no longer entirely empty, that had one small warm point of reference, one dock in one city where the light was right in the late afternoon and a man sat with his daughter and felt accompanied in the way that only one being in a very large universe had cause to feel that exact feeling. Somewhere in the dark between the stars, the traveling had paused, not ended. Paused, staying for a while, with something worth staying with. There were days in the facility when she doubted herself with the specific, grinding quality that comes from doing important work inside a system that doesn't want the work done. She had written the phrase voluntary cognition into her reports 11 times across the first restructuring period, and 11 times the word had been either redacted or reframed in the version that moved upward through the chain of command into the hands of people who had a stake in a particular answer. She understood the mechanism. She'd watched institutional processes for long enough to recognize the way a framework defends itself, not dramatically, not through open resistance, but through the slow substitution of language. The thing she describes as voluntary cognition became complex conditioned response pattern in the second layer of review. Complex conditioned response pattern became advanced behavioral mimicry in the third. By the time the report reached the people at the top of the hierarchy who were making decisions about the program's future direction, the creature she had sat with in a room at 2 in the morning, the ancient, patient, homesick thing that had placed itself in front of a camera and said, "I am here," had been transformed through a series of careful substitutions back into a resource. She filed a counter-report. It was noted and filed alongside the other report. The program continued. Reyes came to her office on a Tuesday in the third week after the demonstration and sat in the chair with the look he'd had since the night of the camera approach. The look of a man whose intellectual honesty and his institutional role were in ongoing, exhausting negotiation. He was losing to his intellectual honesty, which she thought was probably good for him as a scientist and difficult for him as a person. "I've been contacted by a team from the Northern Biological Research Division," he said. "They want samples, tissue from the organism, live samples if possible, and they're asking you. They're informing me that they'll be sending a team in 30 days. He looked at the window, which showed the parking lot in flat afternoon light. "They said the extraction procedure is back on the schedule. Modified protocol. They've consulted with a team that specializes in biological containment of," he stopped, "of organisms with advanced threat profiles. Organisms with threat profiles, their language." She thought about the organism at the window, the fake stars. The 17 minutes, every night without variation, in the posture of something practicing a grief it would never be free of. "Then we have 30 days, she said. "To do what?" "To build a case that can't be translated away." She looked at him. "You've been running analysis on the compound for 3 weeks. You have data on the repair mechanism that nobody else has because you're the only researcher who's been in direct proximity to a living sample for this duration. I need you to write what you actually found, not the institutional version, the science." He was quiet. "Reyes, you know what it is. I know what the data suggests." "Then write what the data suggests, in language specific enough that it can't be reframed as mimicry or conditioned response or anything else. In language that forces the question." She held his gaze. "You became a scientist because you wanted to know what was true. This is true. Write it." He looked at the window for a long moment. The parking lot showed a vehicle arriving, a person getting out with a case, one of the technicians returning from a sample run to the adjacent lab building, ordinary in the way that everything in the facility was ordinary except for the thing at its center. "There are things in the data," He said carefully that I haven't included in the reports, because I wasn't certain how to classify them. Tell me, he told her. The organism's cellular material, the samples he'd managed to collect from the room during periods when the organism had been present and had, apparently, shed minimal quantities of cellular matter the way all living things shed cellular matter, showed evidence of chemical messaging, not in the sense of basic cellular signaling, something more complex, more targeted, a compound that interacted not with Yoon's repair systems but with his limbic system. The emotional architecture, the part of the brain that processed memory attachment safety, not to hijack it, not to manipulate it, to synchronize with it. It's been learning his emotional language, Reyes said, with the specific care of someone saying something they haven't said out loud before and are watching it take shape in the air between them. Every night when it's out, there's a chemical exchange. It's reading him, recording his emotional state. And over time, he paused. Over time, the compound it produces has been modifying, not in the repair function, in the limbic interface. It's tuning itself to him. Mara was very still. That's why the resonance has changed over time, she said. Yun told me it felt more settled, less like translation and more like direct understanding. Yes. The biochemical evidence suggests the organism is actively working to develop a communication interface specific to Yoon's emotional architecture. He looked at his hands. I don't have a framework for what kind of intelligence does that, deliberately. Over 11 days, in the body of a man it chose to be in. She thought about the age estimate, the traveling, the incomprehensible span of alone. What kind of intelligence learns the emotional language of the first being it chooses to accompany? She said. After what might be millions of years of having no one to learn from. Reyes was quiet. A desperate one, he said very quietly. Or a very hopeful one. She thought about that for a long time after he left. She wrote to Yun that evening, to the secure channel Solves had established for monitored correspondence, and she wrote in the careful language of someone writing for two audiences simultaneously, the message she wanted Yun to receive, and the officially unremarkable version that the monitoring would read. She was getting fluent in that doubling, in the way prisoners get fluent in speaking across visiting glass. She wrote about the facility, about the work, about the ongoing nature of the process. She wrote, embedded in descriptions of procedural developments, something that Yoon would understand and the monitoring would read as medical update. The communication interface is developing. It's learning your language. It's trying to be understood. He wrote back 2 days later. The response was brief and written in the same doubled register. He said things were going well. He said his daughter was doing well. He said he'd been sleeping deeply. At the end he wrote, the singing is clearer now, more specific. Sometimes I think it's trying to tell me where it came from. She read that 3 times. Then she wrote back. Ask it to show you, she wrote. Tell me what you see. His response came 6 days later, longer than his previous ones, and she read it in her office at midnight with the door closed and the lights low, reading it twice, and then sitting with it in the way she sat with things that required the full weight of her attention. He wrote about dreams, not nightmares. He was clear about that, emphatic in the way people are emphatic when they understand their words will be read for pathology, not disturbing dreams. Something more like memories that weren't his, images that had the texture of the real, landscapes he'd never visited, sky colors that didn't correspond to Earth's spectrum, vast slow movements of something that might have been atmospheric or oceanic or neither. The sense of enormous distance covered in enormous time alone, and then the sense of something new, light, small, moving with the purposeful irregularity of life. 2 points of light specifically, in a small container at the very edge of the place where the star's influence thinned into the cold dark. He wrote, I think it's showing me how it saw us, when it found us. And then he wrote, 2 lights in the dark. I think that's what we looked like. That's what it followed. She put the letter down on the desk and looked at the ceiling. 2 lights in the dark. She thought about Arnett, who hadn't come home, who had recorded 8 years of birthday messages just in case, who had sat in a small ship for 3 years with Yoon in the kind of companionship that only comes from being in a small space with one person for a very long time and choosing to keep choosing them. 2 lights moving together at the edge of the solar system. She thought about what it would mean to have been alone for long enough that 2 small lights, 2 small human lives, with their compact intensities of care and humor and grief and connection, would register as significant across whatever senses the organism used to perceive the universe. She thought about the first session with Yoon, the way he'd said, shared quiet. She thought about Doran in his room, beginning to find his way back to inhabiting his own experience. About the 14-year-old who'd learned to identify 5 physical sensations and be present in each one. The small human act of insisting on being here in the body, in the moment, in the real. She thought about the organism standing at the projected window for 17 minutes and the patience of something that had been practicing loss for longer than the earth had been cooling. She thought, we spend so much time being afraid of what's out there. We build programs to contain it, to study it, to extract from it what we can use. We send people to the edge of the solar system, and we bring back what we didn't expect, and the first thing we do is figure out how to turn it into a weapon or a medicine. And the thing that came back was just looking for company. She wrote her most important report on a Thursday morning, pulling everything together. Reyes's chemical analysis, the footage documentation, the behavioral profile she'd built across 3 weeks, the limbic interface findings, the correspondence with Yoon. She wrote it in language so specific and so thoroughly evidenced that the institutional process of reframing it would require, she calculated, at minimum 3 levels of deliberate falsification rather than the casual substitution of synonyms. She wrote it so that each layer of translation left a residue, an obvious absence where the replaced word had been, so that anyone who read the final version with attention would see the shape of what had been removed. She sent it up the chain. She waited. 2 weeks later, the team from the Northern Biological Research Division arrived. They were 5 people. 4 of them were the kind of scientists who'd arrived at certainty about what they were doing and what it was for, which she recognized as a particular and unfortunate form of confidence. The 5th was a woman named Dr. Senna Park, who was younger than the others and had the look of someone who'd read Mara's reports with genuine attention. She arrived 3 hours after the rest of the team and spent the first hour reviewing documentation before she sought out Mara in the cafeteria. She sat down across from her without introduction, set her coffee on the table. The limbic interface data, she said. Yes. Race's analysis. Yes. That's not conditioning. That's not adaptive behavior. That she stopped. She had the same look Reyes had had, the one Mara was beginning to recognize as the face of a scientist who was encountering the revisions. That's a language acquisition process. Yes. It's learning how to talk to him. It's learning how to talk to him. Park put both hands around her coffee cup. She was quiet for a moment. I came here to support the extraction protocol. That's what my team is here for. I know. My director is committed to it. I know. He's not going to change his mind because of a limbic synchronization compound, however remarkable. No, Mara said, but you might. Park looked at her. You're not here because your director sent you, Mara said. You're here because you're a scientist and you read the reports and you needed to see it yourself. She held her gaze. So see it. Come to the sessions. Come to the monitoring room. Bring your equipment and your frameworks and your skepticism and let the evidence do what it's going to do. Park was quiet for a long moment. She picked up her coffee and drank some of it. I'd like to review the full footage archive, she said. I'll arrange it. And I'd like to be present at the next session with Yoon. He'd want to meet you, Mara said. He's been waiting for someone to come through that door who was genuinely curious instead of just acquisitive. She looked at Park directly. Don't disappoint him. The next 3 days were the most complicated of the facility's life since Mara had arrived. The extraction team began its preparation work in the adjacent laboratory, which Mara could see from her office, and which she watched with the specific vigilance of someone watching a clock she couldn't stop, but might be able to slow. Reyes, caught between his original institutional role and the internal revolution his data had precipitated, moved around the facility with the energy of someone living in 2 realities simultaneously and finding them increasingly incompatible. Solves presided over the whole thing with the composure of a man who'd spent enough time in high-stakes environments to have learned that composure was a choice available regardless of circumstances, and who'd decided to exercise it. Park spent the 3 days reviewing everything, every frame of footage, every analysis, every report in both its original and institutionally translated versions, which she read side by side in Mara's office with a precision that confirmed what Mara had suspected. She was genuinely excellent at her work. She said almost nothing during the review process. She asked specific technical questions about methodology. She took notes that Mara couldn't see and didn't try to see. On the evening of the 3rd day, Park came to Mara's office at 10 o'clock and sat down. I'm going to write a supplementary analysis, she said. I can't override my director's program authority, but I can submit a formal scientific objection to the extraction timeline on grounds of insufficient characterization of the subject's cognitive status, which will require a minimum 30-day review period before any invasive procedure can be authorized. Mara looked at her. That gives you 30 days, Park said, to build whatever you're building. Why? Because the footage of it at the camera is the most significant thing I've seen in 15 years of xenobiological research, and my director is going to throw it in a box and classify it, and that's wrong. She picked up her coffee. Also because the data doesn't support extraction as safe for the host, and I'm not willing to put my name on a protocol that might kill a man. Mara said, thank you. Don't. Just use the time. She used the time. She wrote to Yoon that night and the next night and the night after that. She wrote with the doubled language, but she also began, carefully, to break the doubling in the direction of more truth. Small violations of the covered language, specific enough to be meaningful to Yoon and ambiguous enough that the monitoring could choose to read them as medical metaphor. She told him about Park. She told him about the 30-day window. She told him that the case was being built in the only way that would hold. In the language of science, slowly, specifically, with the kind of detail that couldn't be reframed without leaving traces. He wrote back, it knows something is happening. It's been more present than usual, more alert. She thought about what it meant for an organism that perceived through emotional resonance to sense the particular quality of threat that was in the facility right now, the preparation for something it had survived 3 previous versions of, the accumulation of intention in the building around it. She wrote, ask it to be patient, tell it we're trying, tell it what we're trying to do. His response came the next morning, I told it. I felt something back that I don't have a word for. It wasn't fear. It was more like watchfulness. Like waiting but not passive waiting. Active. Like it's ready for whatever comes next. Ready, she thought. Not afraid. Ready. She thought about Yoon in the facility, day after day, giving it his memories of his daughter, his specific grief for Arnett, the quiet of 3 years in space, the weight of being chosen by something impossibly old and impossibly alone. She thought about what it was receiving from him. Not just the limbic synchronization data, but the full texture of a human life, with its small ridiculous loves and its specific griefs and its persistent, irrational insistence on mattering despite all the evidence that the universe was not organized with human mattering in mind. 2 lights in the dark. That was what it had seen. That was what had been worth following. The review board convened at the end of the 30 days. Park submitted her analysis. Mar testified. Reyes testified, and his testimony was the most significant contribution. A scientist with an established record who had come to the facility as the extraction program's chief advocate, now presenting evidence that the extraction procedure was scientifically indefensible given the current state of knowledge about the organism's cognitive function. The board didn't love it, but the board was not staffed by people who could afford to have their names attached to a procedure that a scientist of Reyes's caliber had formally characterized as indefensible. The extraction timeline was extended. Not indefinitely, Mara had no illusions about what extended meant, but for a period that allowed for additional characterization study. In the vocabulary of the facility, that was a significant victory. In the vocabulary of the world outside it, the world where Yoon's daughter was growing up, and the fishing boats came in every evening, it was a beginning. She drove out of the facility on a gray morning 9 months after she'd arrived, in a car she'd arranged through channels that didn't require Solveig's signature. She'd given her notice with appropriate paperwork, and a final report that said, with the clarity she'd been building toward the entire time, what she believed to be true, that the organism in that facility was a person, that it had acted as a person throughout its time there, and that the program's ongoing treatment of it as a resource represented a failure of the scientific and ethical obligations that the program was, theoretically designed to uphold. The report was classified the day after she submitted it. She had expected that. She had also, over the months of facility work, built relationships with 3 people whose names she wouldn't write here. People in positions within the institutional structure who shared her assessment and who had agreed to keep asking the questions that the classification process kept burying. The questions had a way of surviving, she'd found. They moved through institutions the way water moved through rock. Slowly, with patience, finding the paths of least resistance, wearing things down. She drove through the steppe in the early morning light and thought about all of it. About Yoon at the dock with his daughter, about the organism at the projected window, watching the fake stars, about Doran in his hospital room, learning to identify 5 physical sensations and be present in each one, about the large, quiet bell and its resonance, about what it meant to be accompanied. She had asked Yoon in her last correspondence before leaving what it was like now, 11 months in. The accompaniment settled into the long territory of something ongoing. He'd written, she asked it something last week, my daughter. She was sitting in the kitchen doing her homework, and she just asked it a question out loud, like you'd ask someone who was sitting in the same room. She asked if it liked the sea he'd written, and I felt the resonance the way I always do. But this time it was different. It was more. Like something that had been very small for a very long time, something that had been keeping itself small for reasons of safety or necessity or grief, was suddenly larger, just for a moment, he'd written. I don't know if it answered her in any way she could perceive, but it answered. And what it said, in whatever language it speaks, felt like yes. Mara pulled off the road for a moment. Not because she needed to. Just because sometimes you needed to stop and sit with a thing before you could carry it properly. She sat in the car on the gravel shoulder in the gray morning light, and she thought about a 12-year-old girl asking a question out loud in a kitchen, the unconscious ease of it, the complete naturalness of addressing the presence she'd grown up knowing was there. She thought about what it must have been like to receive that question, to be asked by a child whether you liked something. Not studied, not contained, not extracted from, just asked, do you like the sea? After a long time of traveling, after a long time of alone. She started the car and drove. The facility grew smaller in the mirror. The steps stretched in both directions, ordinary and enormous, under an ordinary enormous sky. Somewhere below that sky in a coastal city, a girl did her homework and asked questions, and a man watched fishing boats come in, and something old kept watch, and the sea moved the way the sea always moved, without reference to any of them, vast and patient and not requiring their significance for its own. But the sea was there, and the dock was there. And the girl's question was in the air, unanswered in any language the girl could hear, answered in every language the thing in her father's chest could speak. Do you like the sea? Yes. The car moved through the morning, and the road unspooled ahead, and somewhere past the edge of the heliosphere the old dark waited with its new exception. One small warm point in it now, one dock in one city, one girl who'd grown up knowing that the universe had something in it besides distance. That was enough. That was when you stripped away everything that didn't survive translation, all of it. Two lights in the dark, and the choice to follow them home.